Progress. Okay. All right. Welcome. I think I know most of you because I was in this part of the world for 9 years. So thank you for joining me today. I'm Pastor John Loeser, in case there are folks who don't know who I am. I am here to give you information. That's all I'm here to do. I am an elder in the United Methodist Church, been an elder since 2016, been a pastor since 2011, and I'm also the chair of the Wesleyan Covenant Association chapter in the Upper New York Conference. So I'm here to share some things with you. You may or may not know that all kinds of new information has developed over the last couple of weeks. And I thought I would start by asking you what you know about the General Conference, what's happening in the United Methodist Church, and what you know about the potential split of the United Methodist Church. And for those of you who are on Zoom, I am muting you as you're coming in, but if you would like to ask a question, just unmute yourselves, okay? All right, so I guess we'll start. What do you know about the General Conference? It's been postponed. So there was, you know that we have a General Conference every 4 years. General Conference was supposed to happen in 2020. It was postponed once to 2021. It was postponed a second time to 2022. And then about 2 weeks ago, it was postponed for a third time, now to 2024. So there will not be a General Conference happening in the United Methodist Church for at least 5 years and a regular General Conference for 8 years, because the last regular General Conference happened in 2016. Do you know what the General Conference does? Nothing? Is that what I heard? Actually, they do a lot of things, but you may think that they knew nothing. Ultimately, what the General Conference does is they are the ones that receive legislation from all over the United Methodist Church, and they either pass it or deny it. Whatever is passed is put into the Book of Discipline. How many of you know what the Book of Discipline is? Ooh, you're educated people. Very good. I'm glad. All right, so in the Book of Discipline, that is where we have our church laws. Every 4 years, that Book of Discipline can be modified. So that won't happen again until 2024. Now, the reason that this year was supposed to be probably a pivotal year for the United Methodist Church is because there have been legislative proposals, not just one, but I think 5 or 6, to allow for separation in the United Methodist Church along theological lines. I'll just use the terms progressive and conservative for lack of a better term, okay? One of those pieces of legislation was called, for short, the Protocol. Does anybody know about the Protocol? If you do, raise your hand. Some of you are aware of the Protocol. All right. So the Protocol was supposed to allow for local churches and annual conferences to vote to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church and then affiliate with either what is going to be called the Global Methodist Church, which I'll speak a little bit more on in a moment, or another denomination that would come out of the separation of the United Methodist Church. The Protocol is no longer going to be an option, at least not until 2024. And you probably have heard that the Global Methodist Church has announced that it's going to become a real church on May 1st of this year. Anybody hear that? Okay, a bunch of you have. So you're aware of this. All right. So the question is, what does all this mean for local churches? Well, right now, on May 1st, when the Global Methodist Church launches and becomes a real church, right now it's a church in formation, there will be no individual local churches as a part of it on May 1st. But on May 1st, local churches can begin to engage in a process toward disaffiliating from the United Methodist Church and affiliating with the Global Methodist Church if they vote to do so. Now, that process, as I understand it, is being developed by each individual annual conference board of trustees, including our annual conference, the Global Methodist, or the United Methodist Church in Upper New York. I have not seen that process yet. My understanding is that it is supposed to be released, I think, sometime this week. I don't know what that's going to look like quite yet, but what I understand is if there are local churches who choose to disaffiliate from the Upper New York Annual Conference, it's probably going to involve some cost to the local churches. I can't tell you what that cost is going to be because I don't know at this point. But that's going to be different from what we originally thought was going to be the case if the protocol for separation actually had been passed this coming summer, if there was going to be a general conference. Okay? So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to ask, are there questions that you have about what I've said so far? I'm looking at the computer. I don't see any questions up here. No questions.
Did they give a reason for postponing?
Oh, that's an excellent question.
The lady with the glasses.
Lady with the glasses.
Right underneath you.
Right underneath me.
Right underneath you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you have a question on Zoom, you're going to need to unmute yourselves because I can't do that. Well, I'll answer Bonnie's question first. What was the reasoning? The reasoning given was twofold. One being the continuing difficulty with pandemic vaccination, because vaccinations are still required upon entry into the United States from foreign countries. Second reason was that there were some delegates outside of the United States that had not yet gotten their visas to come to the United States. Those were the two official reasons that were given by the Commission on General Conference. Okay? Now, there's some dispute about that, and I won't go into that, but if you're interested in the dispute, I can put you in touch with the people that are disputing it. Okay? Just like everything else, there's always one side and then another side. All right? Okay, so someone on Zoom had a question.
You mentioned there being a cost associated with it. Is there any indication of what that cost is and why that cost is taking place?
So what I can tell you right now is there will be a cost associated with what the conference calls the unfunded portion of the pension liability funds. And this goes back to pre-1982 pensions. I don't know the whole and the long of it, but I know that this is a pension fund that is only funded through the part of your apportionments as local churches that go to the annual conference, and then the annual conference pays into the pension fund, which is run by Westpath, which used to be the General Board of Pensions. Okay? So that's part of the cost. I understand there will also be costs involved legally changing the property deeds from the United Methodist Church to the Global Methodist Church. I don't know what those will be, but I understand they'll be considerable. Other than that, I don't know what other costs are going to be passed on to the local churches from the annual conference. But that information should be
So
out.
if I'm understanding this correctly, if we go to the global church,
Yes,
there will be no cost.
no.
That is where the cost will come in.
The cost will be to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church, and that money will go to pay the United Methodist Church annual conference costs, the pension costs, and whatever legal costs are involved in actually changing the deed of this, say this church wanted to move. It would be the legal costs of changing the deed of this church from the United Methodist Church to the Global Methodist Church. Now, there may be other costs that are involved, but that's what I know so far.
And
Okay,
so if we stay as the United Methodist Church, then we don't have all of those legal costs.
that is correct. If you choose as a local church to stay with the Upper New York Annual Conference in the United Methodist Church, none of this applies. So there's no costs involved.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I was clear in my mind on,
And I thank you for asking the question, because I think that helps the rest of us kind of process this. Because really, this is a lot to take in. And I am still trying to process it myself, and I'm up here trying to explain it to you. So I don't know all the ins and outs of it yet. So if you want to change churches, that information will be coming, or you want to change denominations, that information will be coming this week. Yes, ma'am.
Now, are we still using the designation of post-split United Methodist Church? Is that different from the United Methodist Church as it stands today?
Okay, so that's a great question. The terminology that some of the press is using, the United Methodist News Service is using this terminology, other entities are using this terminology. It's called, this is after the separation happens, the United Methodist Church would then be not necessarily known as, but kind of referred to as the post-separation United Methodist Church. And of course, this would take place after the separation happens. And the separation will not happen in like a day or a week or a month. It's going to gradually happen over time, because local churches, one by one, will make the choice to go from the United Methodist Church to the Global Methodist Church or some other denomination. So once all of that takes place, which might be 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road, 4 years, we don't know, the United Methodist Church as it is today will still exist, will have all of its general organizations, it will have its bishops and its general conference structure. It will just be a smaller denomination. Okay? So that was a good question. Okay, so Bob.
So each individual conference will be able to make their own rules for their churches and their conference for separation?
That is my understanding based on 3 paragraphs in the Book of Discipline. So those paragraphs give a basis, but they don't give all of the details. So that's what the Board of Trustees of each general conference is supposed to do, is fill in those details on how the disaffiliation will go. Does that make sense? Okay,
Okay.
Julie?
You said that they can start as early as May
1st, yes.
May 1st, okay. So there's no time limit on the churches if they decide to disaffiliate with
That-
the United Methodist. They can do it at any point in time?
That is
or
correct.
They have to start the process in May, no
No.
matter how long it takes?
No,
All right.
you, if, let's say, actually church chose to begin the process, but they didn't really want to start it on May 1st. They wanted to take a time of talking about it before they actually did it. So you can do that at any point after May 1st. I mean, you could even start the conversations now if you choose to, but to actually start the process, you would have to wait until May 1st to start the process.
All right, okay.
But there's no time limit on it, no.
Okay. So at any point in time, if the church decided all of a sudden that the regular United Methodist Conference wasn't what they wanted, they could switch to the vote.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep. All right. So I'm not sure if those folks on Zoom heard that, but the question was there a time limit on the process? And my answer was no, there's no time limit on the process. You could start on May 1st, you could start at the end of this year. If you chose to go Global Methodist, that is like an open-ended period of time at this point. Okay? All right.
So John, you mentioned about changing the deed and the cost that could be significant in involving that, but if you wanted to go before that, I know that there was a cost for the property of, your parsonage, if you still had a parsonage, and the cost of the church. Do you hear any information about that? Will there be a cost to buy those properties by your church?
If you wanted to leave before May 5th, period.
Yeah, period. I know before May 1st, I mean, up until now, that's the protocol. You'd have to purchase your properties. So you're not hearing any information that you would have to purchase the properties. It's the cost of the legalities with the deed and such. Is that what you're understanding?
That is my understanding as of right now, yes. I do not believe there will be a purchase cost, but that's something that the Board of Trustees of the annual conference have full control over, according to the Book of Discipline. Okay? So we're waiting for that information. All right. Other questions that folks have? Yes, somebody else on Zoom.
I got
So-
to unmute. I was talking and my hands. So basically, as a small country church,
Yes.
we are almost better off to remain a small country church, correct? Because that whole, I'm not sure I understand the reasoning behind going with the whole global thing. Is that to grow the United Methodist Church
So-
worldwide and swallow up the small churches, or?
No, that's not the reasoning. Actually, I have here, I'll put it right here so you can see. There's a form that I brought. I'm not sure if anybody on Zoom actually got that, but there is a comparison on this form. There's a handout for folks here in Fillmore Chapel, and I'm going to go over this in a few minutes to give you a comparison between what the current Book of Discipline of the United Methodist Church looks like in certain areas. And I'm going to contrast that with the Transitional Global Methodist Church Book of Discipline that has been put together. So I'll give you some differences in those two different churches as to why one congregation or more congregations might want to go from the United Methodist Church to the Global Methodist Church. Okay, so I'm going to do that in a few minutes.
We can do share screen. I have that.
We can share screen.
In my email, and I can bring it up when we get to it.
Okay, so we're going to share the screen with this document. So those of you on Zoom will be able to see it. All right. All right. So Dale, did you have a question?
Yes, I wanted to know how the New York conference plays into this.
How the annual conference plays into it?
The New York State, I'm sorry, Upper New York State Conference where we have to pay them monthly.
Yes. So in the United Methodist Church, each local church is connected to every other local church that is both in the annual conference and in the entirety of the denomination. So every local church pays apportionments. The apportionments go towards funding ministries that the annual conference operates. They basically are intended to be, they do human resources type of work. They control the pension income that each local church pays. And then that money, of course, then goes on to West Path. that pays the salaries of the annual conference, the bishops, the district superintendents, the district's associates, things like that. And there's other ministries that they do. You can find all of that information on the Upper New York Annual Conference website, unyumc.org. The annual conference is the entity of the denomination that the local church deed is held in trust for. Now, I need to explain that. Have any of you heard about the trust clause in the United Methodist Church? Some of you know about the trust clause. So I'm going to share that with you, and this may surprise some of you because it usually does when I share this. In the Book of Discipline, this goes back to John Wesley in the late 1700s. He put this in the first Book of Discipline. Every local church property is held in trust for the good of the denomination, so that the denomination
It's cold.
so that the denomination can continue using the trust clause to promote the growth of the Christian church. So what that really means is, say Fillmore Chapel wanted to disaffiliate. Say you wanted to go and join the Free Methodist Church down the road. You wanted to be a satellite of the Free Methodist Church. This is hypothetical, of course. I'm not saying that you're going to do this. All right. So the trust clause prevents you from doing that because you are a part of the larger United Methodist denomination. You would have to go through the annual conference, first of all, to get permission to leave the denomination and join the Free Methodist Church. And then there would probably be a real estate transaction that would cost money, where this congregation would actually purchase outright the property, and then you could join the Free Methodist Church. Now, I imagine that's probably a surprise to some of you, but that has been in the Book of Discipline since, I think, 1789. And that is for the purpose of attempting to keep the denomination together. This is part of the reason why all of this is taking place, all of the information that the WCA has been putting out for the Global Methodist Church. And starting the Global Methodist Church is going to be a separate entity. So you have the United Methodist Church on one hand, and you have the Global Methodist Church on the other hand. And the Global Methodist Church has some significant differences to it than the United Methodist Church does. Not a whole lot, but some significant differences. So the reason behind all of this talk about the Board of Trustees in the annual conference is that they are the ones that actually have the final say on where each piece of property and building goes. So there has to be some negotiation in that vein. Does that make sense? You want to ask questions about that?
It makes sense. Oh, it makes sense, but the thing I'm not getting is, I mean, yes, we have to look at it in our church from a financial aspect, but if growth of our church is going to be so much better with the global church, but I'm not seeing, I guess what I'm not seeing is the benefits of changing to the global.
Okay, so I'm going to get to that in a moment. I'm going to first ask, is there any other question about the trust clause before we get to the differences?
No.
Bob?
I got an email, I can't remember if it was from the conference or Good News, but there's a short-term protocol in place until August 23rd where a church could leave, or am I misunderstanding?
There is no protocol in place. There is 3 paragraphs already existing in the current United Methodist Book of Discipline that allow for individual churches to disaffiliate, but they are not in line with what the protocol would have put in the book of discipline. They're different. So that's why there's going to be some different, there's going to be differences in how this all works. It's not going to be the same as what has been projected over the last 2 years since the protocol was released 2 years ago. Okay? So right now, the protocol, it's not law. It's not church law, so we can't use it. Does that make sense? Okay.
John, can I ask one more question?
Yes.
Is that protocol still on the table as far as, say we don't do anything right this second? Say we wait it out a little bit and we wait for annual conference or for the general conference. So we wait until 2024. Is that protocol still on the table to be voted upon at that point? And I understand that there's a problem that I'm not sure if it's accurate or not, but I've heard some ideas that they're hoping that the delegates will be different, so the delegates will vote that in.
So this is a question of annual conference, and because the 2020 annual conference was postponed 3 times, there now is going to have to be a declaratory decision by the Judicial Council. Does anybody know what the Judicial Council is? It's the Supreme Court of the United Methodist Church. Does that make sense? So ultimately, the Council of Bishops will send questions to the Judicial Council for clarification on what can and cannot be done under current church law. So right now, there's going to have to be a Judicial Council decision on whether or not the 2024 General Conference is actually a postponed 2020 General Conference or an actual 2024 General Conference. And if it is going to be a 2024 General Conference, then in 2023, every annual conference has to vote new delegates in to serve. But we still don't know what that's going to look like yet. We're going to have to wait. Okay? So that's another possibility. See, I'm probably making your head spin because of all this information. Because ultimately, I don't fully grasp all of this either. So I'm just sharing with you what I know. All right? And this is fluid. It's changing almost day by day. It's changing. And Bob, you had a question.
If each conference now is going to be able to make their own rules regarding this,
Yes.
what difference does general conference make?
So the question is, if each annual conference can make their own rules on this, what difference does general conference make? Right now, general conference is not in the mix of the current work that the annual conference trustees are doing. They are working with the current 2016 Book of Discipline. General conference, when it meets in 2024, will then have the opportunity to make changes to the Book of Discipline. And then we will get a 2024 general or a 2024 Book of Discipline. But until that time, general conference is something in the future. What we're working with for this year is whatever the Board of Trustees of the annual conference comes up with in terms of the process for disaffiliating from the United Methodist Church now and moving to the Global Methodist Church. Does that help? Okay. So again, and if I'm stammering or stuttering with some of this, I apologize. I'm trying to think through it as I give you these answers based on what I know. All right.
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment.
Okay.
It seems like there are so many layers.
You are correct.
And it's so confusing. It's like, you know, and it hurts all of the denominational churches because of their apportionments, because they have to feed all of those layers. Where it's like, maybe the general conference needs to get rid of some of those.
So I'm going to show you something about apportionments between the United Methodist Church and the Global Methodist Church when we get to this momentarily. Ann, do you want to come up and set this up so that the folks on Zoom can see it? So Ann's going to share or screen share this.
Ordination of the medicine is appointments are allowed. Okay. I forget. We had just. Go back one more email.
There it is. Okay, folks on Zoom, can you see that? Okay. All right. So what you see in front of you, so those of you who are in the room here can see it on the screen. Those of you on Zoom can see it on your screens. And if you can't, let me know. So this is a comparison chart. There are 4 columns. I'm going to first of all tell you the column that is farthest to the right that says WCA proposed BDD, disregard that. This document was put together in September of last year. So the book of Doctrines and Disciplines from the WCA at the moment is not relevant, all right? What we're going to be looking at is the far left column, which says doctrine. These are the things that we're comparing between the second from the left column, the current United Methodist Book of Discipline, and then the column just to the right of that, the transitional Global Methodist Church Book of Doctrines and Discipline. Okay? I know this is a lot. Somebody's chatting. Let's see here.
Click on the chat bubble at the top.
Oh, the chat bubble. Oh, there we go. John, will you please zoom the document a bit? Oh, yes, Stephen, I will attempt to do that. Let's see if I can here. Does it work this way? No, it doesn't. Oh, here's the plus. Here we go. I just had to figure it out. Okay. Is that better? A little better? It actually fills the screen that I'm looking at.
Is that a new chat?
New chat. Plus sign on top. Much better. See, there are people who are smarter than me that know how to do this stuff. Very good. Thank you for helping. Uh-oh, now what did I do? Oh, there we go. Got it back. Little bit of laughter in this. That's always good. All right, let's start with the first 3 boxes, doctrinal standards. You see where it says doctrinal standards? So let's see, where is this? Here it is. So here, doctrinal standards. Current Book of Discipline. You know that the current United Methodist Church started in 1968. That's where the current Book of Discipline came from. It, of course, came from before that, but where we are now as the United Methodist Church, much of what we have now came from 1968. So, doctrinal standards of the church, initially in 68 viewed as non-judicial, today not often enforced. Now, I'm not going to be able to have time to go through all the doctrinal standards. If you want to look at them, come to the church. Every local church should have a book of discipline. It's at the beginning. Okay, that's where the doctrinal standards are. In the transitional Global Methodist Church Book of Doctrines and Disciplines, These are mandatory for all clergy to preach and maintain. Doctrinal standards, okay? And I should say something else. This, where it says transitional GMC BDD, the reason it's transitional is because the Global Methodist Church is still in formation when it launches on the 1st of May. As local congregations and clergy come into it, within 12 to 18 months, the plan is to have a general conference of the Global Methodist Church to either affirm or modify this book of doctrines and disciplines that we're looking at here, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, very good. So this is what's proposed for the Global Methodist Church that will be, the church will launch with, all right? 2 columns down, underneath doctrinal standards, it says articles of religion and confession of faith. Current book of discipline, stated doctrinal standards, seldom referenced, deemed congruent but not reconciled to each other. Now I'm going to share something with you. What they're talking about, articles of religion and confession of faith. The articles of religion came from the original Methodist Church, which are from John Wesley, who modified them when they came out of the Anglican Church in England. Okay? They've come down to us today. That's the articles of religion. The confession of faith is similar, but somewhat differently worded, comes from the Evangelical United Brethren Church, which the Methodist Church merged with in 1968. I see I'm starting to lose some of you. Okay, so if I am, just raise your hand. Ask me what you need to know. The United Methodist Church that we have today is a blend of other denominations, okay? So that's where these come from, articles of religion, confession of faith. Oh, someone else wants to get in. Where are we here? Okay. Let's see. Under the global church, the doctrinal standards that define the doctrinal boundaries of the Global Methodist Church. That's exactly what these will be, articles of religion and confession of faith. And this is something that, as a pastor, I had to write on these before I was ordained. And I used that writing to preach sermons on the articles of religion and confession of faith. I think I did it for those of you at Exley when I was with you, and I have done it for the folks in Baker as well. Because part of what we're tasked with as pastors is to share with you Wesleyan theology, because we are Wesleyan in our theology. Okay? Underneath that, at the bottom, Wesley's 44 standard sermons. This is stated in the doctrinal standards in our current book of discipline in the UMC. These will be the normative Wesleyan standards that define Methodist teaching in the Global Methodist Church. So folks like me and other pastors, we all will have to brush up on our Wesley sermons so that we can share them with you. All right. Oh, I went way too far. Let's go back. Next page, page 2. So turn the page over. It should be double-sided. General rules. So in the current United Methodist Church, these are the stated doctrinal standards. How many of you know the general rules of our church? Does anybody know the general rules of the church? You should have heard this. Do no harm. Heard this? Sound familiar? Do all the good that you can. Attend to the ordinances of God, or in the more modern way of saying it, stay in love with God. You've heard this? Doctrinal standards. General rules, okay? In the Global Methodist Church, this will spell out explicit expectations of Methodist discipleship, okay? Underneath that, Holy Scripture, United Methodist Church. Our Book of Discipline states, these are the primary source and criterion for Christian doctrine. In practice, it can be modified or reinterpreted by other sources. This is what's been happening over the 50 years, 52 plus years of the United Methodist Church. What it will be in the Global Methodist Church, Holy Scripture will be the primary rule and authority for faith, morals, and service, against which all other authorities must be measured. So have you heard of, in the United Methodist Church, the quadrilateral? You don't know that one? I've taught those of you in Exley what the quadrilateral is. Scripture, reason, experience, and tradition of the church. You've heard this? Okay, that's the Wesleyan quadrilateral. What's primary? Scripture. Scripture's primary in that. But that's been reinterpreted as well in some places in the United Methodist Church, okay? In the Global Methodist Church, that will not be permitted. All right? Now I'm going to ask you to go to page 3. And we can look at other things on this after I'm done sharing this with all of you if you wish. But I just, for sake of time, because I know it's now, that says 12:30? It's 1:30, okay. Now, nobody got up and changed the big clock in the back yet. All right, so page 3, we're going to look at human sexuality is the second box. Book of Discipline says, it is God's gift to all persons, affirmed only with the covenant of monogamous heterosexual marriage. But you see underneath that it says likely to be changed in a post-separation UMC. So this is what is expected is going to take place in the United Methodist Church as time goes on. In the Global Methodist Church, what we currently have in the United Methodist Church is what will be continued on into the United Methodist or into the Global Methodist Church. Okay? And underneath that, 2 boxes down, marriage. Under the Book of Discipline of the United Methodist Church, affirms the marriage covenant expressed in love, support, commitment, and shared fidelity between a man and a woman. However, this is another area where it is likely that this may be changed as time moves forward. In the Global Methodist Church, the same definition will stand and it will not be changed. Okay? Any questions so far? Okay, no questions so far. We'll keep going. Under local church, mission of the church. Now you see the differences in the mission statements of the church. The United Methodist mission statement, to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. The Global Methodist mission statement, make disciples of Jesus Christ who worship passionately, love extravagantly, and witness boldly. It's a little bit different, a little bit more expressive. Okay. Let's go on to page 4. Should be on the back side. Yeah, do it slowly, it works better. Under local church organization. Now, is it my understanding in Fillmore Chapel that you've gone to a one committee organization? Leadership board? Yeah. So the Global Methodist Church realizes that there are a lot of small churches like Fillmore Chapel that probably don't have enough people to fulfill all of these different committees that are listed on here. There will be flexibility there. This is something, as I understand it, in the United Methodist Church, that's a recent thing where one board operates the entire church, and it's simply because for the lack of a number of people to be able to fill out all of these others that are actually required by the current Book of Discipline. Okay? Does that make sense, Ann?
Yeah, I can't, of course, recall the paragraph off the top of my head, but there is provision in the discipline for the single leadership.
Okay. Yeah, I think I have read it as well. So that's something that will be flexible within the Global Methodist Church as well. And then underneath that, now this is where I'm going to tell you about the apportionments, because that was a question that was brought up and I went too far. Let me go back up. So in the United Methodist Church, in our annual conference, every local church's apportionments are approximately 14% of the annual budgetary income for the church. This says generally between 7 and 15%. In our conference, it's 14%. Okay? In the Global Methodist Church, the goal is 1.5% of the local operating budget will go to the general church, and an additional 5% will go to the annual conference. That's 6.5%. The intention there is to allow for the local church to retain more of its funds to do local mission, which is where we know that the mission takes place in the local churches. So that's the goal, to reduce the annual apportionments by that amount. Okay, I'll stop for questions. No questions?
I have one.
Oh, go ahead.
So we actually will be paying less in apportionment, but we've already bankrupted ourselves with all of the deed changes and everything else. Is there a trade-off there?
That is an excellent question. And that is something that you will need to take into account. Each local church will have to take things into account when you're making the decision or to go somewhere else. Okay, wait a minute. Let's see if I can fix this. I'm going to stop share for a minute. Okay, so let's, Sue, did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay. All right. Now we're going to go back to sharing, which is this one. Okay. All right. Any other questions about what I've shared so far? Okay. All right, next page, page 5. Fidelity of churches. Not stated in the Book of Discipline in the current United Methodist Church. What will be expected in the Global Methodist Church? Allow for involuntary disaffiliation if necessary for churches teaching doctrines or engaging in practices contrary to the Global Methodist Church Book of Discipline. So what that means is the intention for the Global Methodist Church is that there will be much more uniformity amongst the churches. Whereas in the United Methodist Church, you can go to many United Methodist churches all over this area, all over the country, and you may recognize some things that are being taught, but while you might not recognize others based on what you're used to in your own local congregation. This suggests that there will be much more uniformity in teaching. Okay? Down underneath, where it says local church property, or just church property, held in trust for the denomination. I told you about the trust clause. In the Global Methodist Church, each local United Methodist Church will be owned by that congregation. There will be no trust clause. Okay? Down below, under ministry, certified lay ministry. I know that there are several of you in here that are familiar with that because I've taught some of you. certified lay servants, lay speakers, lay ministers, deaconesses, home missioners, and lay missioners. That's the various categories of lay ministry that are currently in the United Methodist Church. In the Global Methodist Church, they seek to combine it into one category for simplification. And each minister will specialize in many different ways, wherever they are called and gifted to serve. Okay? Flip it over, go to page 6. At the very bottom of page 6, financing theological education. So those of you who are in lay ministry now and you feel a call to go on to become a clergy, like those of us, some of us who are in here who felt that and went on to be called clergy. In the United Methodist Church currently, what we have to do is we have to look for grants, loans, tuition reduction, things like that in order to finance our education. In the Global Methodist Church, the plan is for theological education to have a fund to make loans to students which are forgivable. 20% of the debt will be forgiven for each year of service to the church. So that's something that the United Methodist Church has not been able to do. And any of you have ever gone to annual conference? Every year when Bishop Webb ordains people, he will ask a question. Are you in debt? As to be embarrassed by it. That's in our book of discipline that he has to ask. And they say no, and then they giggle. And the reason some of them giggle is because some of them are in debt. Some of us are still in debt. And then the bishop turns around and he hears the people out in the audience giggling too, and he says, now this is serious. We have to do something about this because we're putting our people in debt and we shouldn't be doing that. Well, here the Global Methodist Church is going to try to find a way to do that. Okay?
Question on that.
Yes.
Would it be like forgivable for, like, say you just started more education and you had to finance it? Are they only forgiving every year after you take out that financing, or is it like rated up to that too? So
My
that
understanding.
20% for years previous.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure of the answer to that. My understanding is that this will be an education fund that will be somehow incorporated into the Global Methodist Church, and so money will be drawn from it. And so it would be that money that would be forgiven. If you were to have, like, say you had college loans for your undergrad, I don't think that would be included.
No, so I'm saying, like, say you took that loan money to further your education as minister, so like you went back for your doctorate, something like that. Would that 20% be forgiven from the years since the loan was taken out, or if you were preaching before that, would they count those things?
Oh, I see. Okay. That I'm not sure of. I think that's something that probably has to be worked out yet. But thank you for the question. Very good. All right, let's go to the next page, page 7. I'm just going to look at one thing on here at the top, lay supply pastors. So we have lay supply pastors currently in the United Methodist Church. In the Global Methodist Church, they will be ordained deacons within 3 years with no sacramental authority. So that what the intention is, if you become a lay supply pastor, it is expected that you will go on to continue into the process of becoming an actual pastor in some way, shape, or form. That's my understanding of what this is looking like right now. Okay?
I have a question.
Yes.
On the page before, it talks about licensed local pastors for long-term congregations.
Yes.
That's allowed in the current church.
Yes.
In the Global Methodist, it says no, they will be transitioned to ordained deacons. Does this mean they have to go back for further education? Is there a structured program that they need to be involved in, or is it implying that they've been doing this for a while, now we'll transition them to this different designation?
So my understanding is, and this, for those of you who are on Zoom, this goes back to page 6 at the bottom, under licensed local pastors. The question is about transitioning licensed local pastors from the current United Methodist Church into the Global Methodist Church, and if there are additional education requirements. Is that correct? Did I get you?
Correct.
Okay. So my understanding is it will probably depend on the level of education each licensed local pastor currently has as to whether or not they have to go on for additional education. The intention there is there will not be licensed local pastors in the Global Methodist Church. They will be ordained either as permanent deacons or as deacons on a track to become an elder. The educational requirements, according to what I've read, are not going to be as extensive as they currently are in the United Methodist Church, but it will also depend on the level that each clergy person chooses to get to. If they want to stay as an ordained deacon, they will have sacramental authority within their local church, and they will also have voting authority in the annual conference, which they currently do not have. So that's part of the reasoning behind that. Does that answer your question?
It does. I'm just wondering, there are several local pastors, licensed local pastors in our area.
Right.
So do they just, my question was, do they just transition title? Does their title just change, or is there a whole process going to be involved in that?
My understanding is that the transition from the UMC to the GMC of a licensed local pastor is they will move from being a licensed local pastor to an ordained deacon. And it will depend on where they are in their education as to what they have to take to fulfill that. Does that help?
It does.
Okay. All right, so that was on page 6. We looked at page 7. Any question on page 7? You all just continue to be retired, as I understand it. You continue to gain your pension and.
Yeah, when I read that segment there,
Oh, this one, mandatory retirement age?
no, the rights that are retired.
Well, the rights, okay.
So at this time, I've been retired almost 2 years. Yeah, it's been 2 years. So when a new local church, does it start at square one again at first year of retirement, or does it pick up right where I left off?
Oh, that's a good question that I don't know the answer to, but I'll try to find out for you, Kim.
Okay.
Yeah, very good question. All right, anything else on page 7? Okay, flip to page 8. So I'm just trying to stick to some things that you may be familiar with. We're just going to look at the district superintendents on this page. So the district superintendents are appointed by the bishop. They have a 6-year term. They have a 12-year term limit, and they can have a 2-year extension. In the Global Methodist Church, there will not be district superintendents. There will be what are called presiding elders. Now, I saw this at work when I was in England about 10 years ago. In the British Methodist Church, which is not directly affiliated with the United Methodist Church, but is a Methodist denomination in and of itself, they operate with this system, presiding elders. The presiding elders will have their own church, as right now, the district superintendent does not have a congregation. The presiding elder will have a congregation and will also oversee several other churches, local churches, that have their own pastors or pastoral teams. And that's also something that's in development, okay? My understanding for going back to this is because it's almost unmanageable for the district superintendents to do their jobs today because they're overseeing so many local congregations. The Global Methodist Church, the people who are working on this, they see the difficulty with that, which is why they're going back to this system. Okay, questions on this? All right, Then let's go to page 9. Yes, Bob.
The appointment process, can you explain what's going on there?
Appointment process.
Can you scroll up so we can see the bottom part?
Yes.
Okay, okay.
Okay. So you know how the appointment process works here in the current United Methodist Church, where the bishop and the cabinet, they look at the church profile. You all fill out a church profile, right? You're shaking your heads, yes, so that's good. You know how to do that. Some of you do anyway. And then the pastors have to fill out a pastor profile. It's the same thing. The bishop and the cabinet, they look at these while they're making appointments. Did you know that appointments are annually? So for the 9 years that I was in Wilson, every year I had to ask, can I stay in Wilson for another year?
We asked to have you.
And you asked to have me stay for another year, and they honored that for 9 years. They honored that. So annual appointments. Every single local church appointment is looked at by the bishop and the cabinet, and they make the appointments during the season, which is starting in December through annual conference season. Okay? This says here in the Global Methodist Church, they will attempt to maintain existing appointments during the transition if possible. What that means is, if a local church wants to transition from the UMC to the GMC, it's going to be much easier if their pastor transitions with them. If their pastor chooses not to transition with them, then the Global Methodist Church Council will have to find another pastor to put in there. And if the local church pastor wants to transition, but the local church doesn't, then that local church pastor will have to be appointed through an appointive process. So, but what it also says here is the bishop, or there won't be any bishops on May 1st. I don't know where they're gonna, how that's all gonna work yet. That's not been made clear. But eventually the Global Methodist Church will have bishops. The bishops will also make an appointment through consultation with the clergy person and the PPR or SPRC committee. So the local churches, as I understand it, will have more input into who they get as local pastor, as a pastor of local church than they currently do. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, let's go to page 9. Oop, now what did I do here? And I'm just going to look at one thing on here under conferences. Adaptability of the Book of Discipline. So there are what are called central conferences in our denomination. These are the conferences that are outside of the United States. So Africa, Philippines, Western Europe, Russia, Ukraine, these all have conferences of the United Methodist Church. Local churches are in these places. They are part of central conferences. Currently, in the United Methodist Church, a central conference can adapt certain parts of the discipline to fit their legal and cultural situations. Whereas in the United States, we are not supposed to do that. We're not given that legitimacy. My understanding is that there is a proposal to the General Conference, when it meets, to change that so that there will be more adaptability in the United States than there currently is. In the Global Methodist Church, the Book of Doctrines and Disciplines is not adaptable unless a particular provision states that it may be adapted. So that will be cultural and legal things that will be specifically spelled out. Okay? This again is an attempt to make the church more uniform all throughout the world, wherever there are local churches. Okay? So we've been here for a little over an hour, so I'm going to stop. I'm going to ask if there are any other questions that you want me to answer before we end. I'm sure I didn't answer all your questions, and maybe you don't even know what your questions are, but I'll tell you that you probably will have more questions as time goes on. I'm going to encourage you to do a couple of things. First of all, you might want to sign up if some of you probably already are, signed up for the annual conference weekly update. They send that out every Wednesday. So this helps to keep us informed of what's going on with the annual conference. That's probably where the announcement will come from the Board of Trustees on the process that they're putting in place for local churches to disaffiliate. So I think you just call the communications office in Syracuse and give them your email address, and they will hook you up with that. They'll send it to you every Wednesday afternoon. Weekly digest, thank you. Okay, oh, there's a chat that just came up. Wait a minute, can't see this without these. That's over here. May be helpful to answer, what is the risk waiting for General Conference 2024 for conservative churches? Okay, so that's a question. I will attempt to answer that. So let's say there is a conservative consensus within your local church and you decide that you want to move to the Global Methodist Church. Is there a risk in waiting for the 2024 General Conference? I personally do not see one, because there's a possibility that the process that the current Board of Trustees of the annual conference gives us, that could be more expensive than it might otherwise be if the protocol is actually voted and passed in 2024. So my understanding is it may be to your benefit to wait, but that will be a process of discernment to determine if you want to go on May 1st or after and how much it will cost, versus the possibility that the protocol passes where there are the possibility for lower costs to move from one denomination to the other. Okay?
My question is, with Pastor Ann retiring, now we're doing all of this in the middle of having to select a new pastor. And I realize there's a lot of time that can go by, like it's kind of redundant that we're worrying about all of this now. That's not going to happen for 5 years, and it's all going to probably change. Am I?
So Sue has a point. And a lot of what you're going to have to discern and consider as you determine if you want to stay United Methodist or you want to move to the Global Methodist Church is, how does moving or staying benefit this congregation? What's going to be better for this particular, whatever congregation you're from, you have to determine what's going to be best for your congregation. But beyond that, I would encourage you to spend time in community prayer and seek God's will for your congregation. Because if it's God's will for you to stay in the United Methodist Church, God's going to make a way for you to do that and be successful. If it's God's will for you to move to the Global Methodist Church, then God will make a way for you to do that as well. That's what I believe. But I think that's going to be up to each individual congregation to spend prayer and time, and spend time in prayer and discernment to determine where you should be at this point in time. The other thing I'll suggest to you is every day I get a daily digest news service from the United Methodist News Service. UMC, I think it's UMC, umnews.com. Go there. There's a place that says Daily Digest. You click on it and you can find a place where you can just add your email and you'll get that in your email every day. This is mainly where I receive daily updates to all this stuff from the United Methodist News Service. So I'm going to encourage you to do those couple of things. Get your information from the conference, from the weekly digest, get your information from the denomination, from the daily digest. And you will be able to try to at least keep up with some of this. There's still far more information that's out there. I'm still trying to read through it. I don't have all the answers, but I've given you what I have. Any other questions? Julie?
I just think it's better if you start the conversations within your church now, instead of waiting for the end and trying to decide with a knee-jerk reaction.
I agree.
You know, things are definitely gonna change.
Yes.
So it's put in print and it's,
Yep.
it is final. Things are gonna change on it, but it's better to be up with the changes and current
Yep.
with the changes than it would be. And it's good to start the conversation, because there's people who don't want to know anything about it, but down the road, yeah, they are gonna want to know about it.
Mhm.
And so I think that the more educated you are on it, and you can follow it and see where the ebbs and flows are gonna be, the better off you're gonna be when it comes to making that decision.
Yes. Very good advice. Don't wait. Start talking about it now if you have not already begun talking about it. Because changes will come. And you can decide to do nothing, and that's okay. And you will just stay United Methodist. And if that's the path that you believe God is leading you on, then that's what you should do. But if you feel you need to move from the UMC to the GMC, then that also has to be discussed. And you need to look at what that's going to cost, what that's going to mean. What might that do to your individual congregation? Will there be people who will disagree with that decision? Or will there be people who will disagree with the decision to stay United Methodist? This is a very contentious time in the church. It has been at the upper levels of the church for some time. Now it's coming down to the local churches. I had hoped that we would not have to do this. Unfortunately, it looks like we now do. I am here. I'm available to you as a resource. Yes, Bob.
The trustees are looking at new rules. Are these going to be voted on an annual conference, and are they just trying to be proactive because they feel it's going to be inevitable? The split is eventually going to happen.
The rules that I was talking about before, they, as far as I know, they do not need to be voted on at annual conference, but I could be mistaken. So let's just keep watching and see what happens. Okay? You're welcome. I will give you two other pieces of information that you can look at. If you want more information about the Global Methodist Church, just Google Global Methodist, and you will find their website that has all of this information and far more on it for you to look at. And you can also go to the WCA website, wesleyancovenant.org. They also have a multitude of information about all of what's going on. There's podcasts that you can listen to. There are articles that have been written over the last 5 years that you can read about all the process that has led us to this point. So again, I'm grateful that you're here, that you listened. I think that people who are informed are going to have a much easier time than people who are not informed of what's going on. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll stop the share and I'll let Pastor Ann finish that. And I'll hang around if anybody wants to talk to me in person and ask any particular questions that we didn't